Now we are going to begin the discussion session. So it's going to be held in hybrid format. In fact, the two foreign speakers are joining us online. So we have invited the three speakers for, rather three discussants for a discussion. So the Im Sung-taek, the lawyer, and also the Cho Il-hwan from the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries, and Kim Han-ho, professor in Seoul University, will participate as discussants for this discussion. As you know, we are talking about the SDG and ESG, which are truly the two buzzwords in our society nowadays. ESG is not really a new thing. Rather, it categorizes what we have already discussed and emphasized. But what's important about ESG is that investors and companies start to be involved, which create and amplify the ripple effects much greater than before. As we heard from the Dongwon president, we see that the ESG management, yes, when we first started, it can be a cost burden. But then once they start that, they actually found a huge benefits. For example, like effective management of risk and so on. So now I'm going to give time to the panelists for their short remarks. So beginning with the Im Sung-tae, partner of the law firm Jipyeong, and then the Professor Kim Han-ho, and last but not least, we'd like to hear from Cho Il-hwan from the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries. And you can also introduce yourself in your remark briefly. For how long? I will give you 10 minutes. Very nice to meet you. I am Im Sung-taek, and I am the partner lawyer of the law firm Jipyeong. We created the ESG Center in our law firm, and I'm also the director of that center. I'm very honored to talk about the SDG and ESG at this auspicious World Ocean Forum. So I really enjoyed the presentations by foreign and domestic speakers that dealt with various issues in fisheries. As an ESG expert, today I would like to talk about some international trends and how they affect the fishery industry. So regarding ESG, if you ask me to introduce a book, then of course I cannot point out one book, but usually I recommend the book called Transformation of Capitalism. And this is authored by a Harvard University professor, and it really encapsulates what ESG is about. And if you look at the international trend, you can see as for we have to look at EU and US, and in fact the EU is the driver of ESG. So ESG remained really high on agenda in EU, and they create all kind of mandatory legislations. So in order to pursue EU Green Deal, they legislate the EU climate law, and disclosure becomes mandatory. And in order to build the system for that, they have revised and built the taxonomy system, and they also have come up with the benchmark regulations. So utilizing that, they're actually creating and leading the trend of ESG. And recently, this year, in order to pursue blue growth for the ocean economy, they have come up with a new agenda called Sustainable Blue Economy. And they also have flesh out and specify concrete measures. And recently, they also have come up with the Fit for 55, which is the package of legislations to reduce GHG emission by 55% versus the 1990 level, before the end of 2030. So it includes the CBAM as well as the complete stop of the ICE cars and the inclusion of shipping in EU ETS. And not just the environment, for social or human rights, they have also strengthened the regulations on human rights monitoring as well as human rights respect. So they have come up with various legislation. And as for the ocean sector, I actually read the reports and I found that the EU has come up with very aggressive proposals to preserve the ocean environment. Whereas the United States, it's a little bit different that rather than trying to adopt the legislative actions, they are trying to establish ESG more with the market-based measures. In fact, the former President Trump was pretty passive about ESG. That's why the markets moved first and they created their own initiatives for ESG. So, for example, like the BRT or Business Roundtable was announced back in 2019, mainly led by companies, and it is about the corporate mission and corporate purpose. And also the investors, including BlackRock, they are also driving for ESG. So these kind of market-based initiatives are led by the US. For example, like RE100. In other words, the companies pledge to utilize production services that are produced purely 100% renewable energy. So centering around the EU and the US, ESG has become a global trend. So not just in advanced nations, developing countries are also paying attention. So this has emerged as a global issue. And regarding the oceans and fisheries, as for the ESG trend, yes, ESG trend started as a response to climate change, but nowadays it's more about biodiversity as well as human rights protection. So the task force on nature-related financial disclosure was launched. In the past, we had the TCFD or Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, but now we even have the task force for companies to disclose all kinds of negative and positive impacts on natural capital. And also, there are more and more stringent requirements for human rights protections. So, for example, like EU has come up with the legislation recently to make it mandatory the human rights audit. So ESG really shows a huge transformation that the capitalist market is now undergoing. And I believe that this is going to have huge implications directly and indirectly on oceans and fisheries as well. MSC talked about the program, the certificate, and I heard that in fact the European consumer, they are really conscious of the MSC certificates and they are trying to purchase fish and fishery products which receive the MSC certificates. And I believe that this is going to soon be a reality in Korea as well. And the Dongwon, they have come up, they decided to produce the ES report every year. But still, Korea is at toddler phase when it comes to ESG and sustainability report. A lot of companies still not produce ESG report. And also a lot of regulations are concentrating on large companies regarding ESG, and many small and medium enterprises are not really covered by regulations. And also as we focus more and more on biodiversity and human rights, Again, we have to develop the right framework to promote human rights as well as the decent workplace. So these social issues, I think, will take a growing importance in the future for the ocean and fishery sector as well. So in order to stimulate and promote ESG in fishery sectors, the small-scale subsistence fishermen, it's very difficult for them to pursue ESG and follow the trend of ESG. So the European countries have recently revised the disclosure requirements, and now all the companies with more than 10 employees are required to disclose ESG reports. However, Korea, you see, that Korea has a very long way to go for ESG reports and requirements. We don't really have the appropriate framework. We only cover large companies only. But in reality, whether it's supply chain or consumers, market changes and ESG requirements, I believe that will have implications even on small-scale companies as well. And therefore, we have to create the ecosystem. And we also, government should provide support so that these small companies can also join this big trend of ESG. And so for this, I think that we have to devise the appropriate measures and plans. And with that, I would like to conclude my comment. Thank you. Thank you very much. So you talked about the international trends in ESG, and I believe that the ESG is an inevitable trend. But as for the oceans and fisheries sectors, we actually have a lot of SMEs, so we have to think about how to adapt ESG, and in the sense, government does have a special role to play. Next, I would like to invite the Professor Kim Hano of Seoul National University for his remark. So, good afternoon. Good morning. I am Kim Hano, Professor of Seoul National University, and currently I'm researching and lecturing the international trade in university. I'm very honored to have this opportunity to serve as a panelist in this forum. So it has been about 250 years since the Industrial Revolution. Over the past 250 years, human beings have accepted, rather the things that the human beings have accepted as normal so far are now being perceived as abnormal. In other words, recently, everything surrounding our lives are upended, and massive transformation is now underway. And also recently, as you know, we are swept by mega trends. For example, like the climate change, which is now emerging as a reverse action from the 250-year-long capitalistic activities. And also the post-COVID, these are sort of the mega trends. And for countries like Korea, we're actually experiencing a serious population aging and fertility decline. The digital revolution is another mega trend that we are faced with. Knowledge-based economy and the digital technology, they again all upend our day-to-day lives, and everything that have been perceived as normal become abnormal. So humanities have to adapt to and thrive on this massive transformation at individual, national, and global level. And I believe that SDG and ESG can serve as the reference or the standards for us to adapt to these mega transformation, massive trends. And yes, we are still at early phases, but so as I said earlier, the ESG is actually changing the way that companies run business for the past 250 years. In the past, companies only focused on financial benefit and financial interest, but now they are required to maximize ESG benefits. So this requires a massive transformation. In order to achieve the non-financial benefit and non-financial goals in a non-market method, I think this is something that companies are now being required. Of course, we cannot say every market principle is effective, but still, I think that market is the most effective mechanism, and this is something that we have to emphasize while pursuing ESG. So the first presenter, Professor Matthew Tan, he talked about the new technology adoption. And the second speaker from MSC, Patrick Hallel, the director. I also enjoyed his presentation. So MSC program works as a sort of the incentive to encourage companies to adopt good practices. So this is a sort of the market-based mechanism, I guess. And also the president of Donghwan, he also talked about some market-based mechanism as well. So in this era of massive transformation, you see there are a lot of changes that are led by market mechanism. And one example, in the agriculture and fishery industry, so from the production to the final consumption, there is a long continuum and there is a very complicated value chain in between, from farm to table. In other words, all the producers and the agricultural products that are produced from farms, they're going to be processed and packaged and then transported to the distribution centers and finally to the table of consumers. So it involves a lot of multiple processes. And recently, because of the COVID pandemic, and as well as because of some social phenomena, including population aging and decrease, as well as because of issues like carbon neutrality. So as they are combined and start to work in combination in the markets, a lot of transportation and logistics processes are now being integrated and combined into fulfillment process. So in other words, there were separate phases of packaging, distribution, and transportation, but now a lot of these processes are being integrated into one. In other words, in a single distribution center or in a single fulfillment center, packaging and like distribution and logistics, all of them are taking place. And this trend is mainly led by e-commerce companies, online retailers. So they combine and integrate the processing and the logistics and distribution processes in order to reduce carbon footprint and also improve energy efficiency. So this is the way that the market goes today. So it's just an example, but you can see that a lot of progresses have been made by market-based mechanism. And the Professor Matthew Tan, he talked about the indicator-based approaches. So in other words, the international organizations, in order to achieve the massive umbrella goals, they come up with the specific targets as well as the ways to implement and monitor, and that's why they have to develop indicators. But as indicators become very specific, in some cases, yes, the long-term goals could be very novel, but as you know, devils are in details. So these specific indicators can actually serve as a barrier to market functions that restrict the market functions. So in other words, very anti-market indicators can be developed in some cases. I'm not an expert in indicator development, but whether it's internationally or domestically, when we devise indicators, we have to really understand the short-term, mid-term, and long-term market impacts, and various researches are required. Only then I believe that we will be able to develop appropriate right indicators. So in summary, whether it's SDG or ESG, yes, these are inevitable trends that we must embrace. But as for the goal achievement, I think that these are somehow centered around only by international organizations or international non-profit organizations in the format of a sort of ethics movement. So if we go that way too much, of course, we cannot exclude the influences of these organizations, but still, I believe the market force should be the dominant one. And in fact, the market force is making its own progress as well. And therefore, the market-based incentives should be developed further, and indicators that can review and track the progresses made by the market-based measures. I believe that we can actually attain our goals much earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to turn to Mr. Il-hwan Cho, the Fishery Resources Policy Bureau Officer. So he would share with us the policy efforts in order to achieve SDGs and then the various incentives provided by the government. Mr. Cho, please. I'm Il-hwan Cho, the Fisheries Resource Policy Bureau Officer of the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries. I really appreciate the presentations as well as the discussions. The ESG management and SDG have become the hot topic and discussion subject. I hope today's discussion will serve as an opportunity for us to set the direction to pursue by the maritime and fisheries industry, whether it's ESG or SDG. The fundamental concept is the same: sustainability. And sustainability originates from fisheries, I believe, because the fishery resources are renewable natural resources, and sustainability is the most important factor in fisheries resource management. For example, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, enacted in 1972, is focused on the maximum sustainable yield. And maximum sustainable yield-based fish resources management. And the UN Fish Stock Agreement, FAO Responsible Fisheries, but these international norms and standards have been established and implemented accordingly. Unfortunately, the fishing resources decrease has not been successfully reversed. The situation in Korea is even more serious. As the director of FAO mentioned, the fish catch has been stagnant, but the catch by the Korean vessels peaked at 1980s at 172 million tons, but now it's almost halved to 900,000 tons recently. According to the Korean scientist, there is only 300 million tons of fishery resources. In order to use fishery resources sustainability, you should be able to catch only 25% of the available fish resources. So 25% of 3 million tons would be 750,000 tons, but annually, Korean fishery industry catches 900,000 tons of fish resources. So this is not sustainable. As mentioned by many speakers, aquaculture has increased its importance, and its prospect is very bright, and it will develop further. But Korean people love the raw sushi and fish, and most of them are from catch. And in this case, well, you don't need to manage them, you don't need to use antibiotics. So the only requirement as to the catch is a proper level of harvest. But we have to make dedicated efforts in order to maintain the level of harvest, in order to ensure sustainability. The Korean government policy for sustainable fisheries is twofold. Of course, there are many other policies, but let me elaborate only on two parts. The first is fishery restructuring. Korea has carried out various fishery restructuring since 1990s. About 220,000 fishing boats have been reduced, and now we have about 42,000 boats. But given the size of the Korean Ocean, the 42,000 is too much. We say Chinese vessels are too many out there, but per unit, Korea has twice as many vessels than China, and 7 times that of Japan. Since those vessels are competing against each other, we are witnessing the depletion of fishery resources, and this has served as the bone of contention so far in the fisheries industry. So it's like that we have 10 people, but we have only 7 bowls of rice. So a certain level of restructuring needs to take place in order to ensure sustainability of the fishery in Korea. Let me take an example. Large fishing companies have suffered due to the failure in reaching an agreement between Korea and Japan as to the fishery negotiations. And out of 24 fleets, through the negotiation with the government, well, the number of the fleet was reduced to 19, 25% reduction in restructuring, and as a result, the fisheries profit was turned surplus, and the size of the mackerel they catch has grown significantly. And the second is total allowable catch scheme. Most of the Western countries have used output control, while Korea, Japan, and other Asian countries have adopted input control. In Korea and Japan, catches have significantly reduced, but countries that have implemented strict fisheries management based on TAC have maintained or increased their catches. In theory and in practice, output control is more effective for fisheries resources management. We can clearly see from this example. So Korea is also turning to output control for its fishery management system. Currently, about 30% of catch is managed and controlled under TAC, and by 2030, the ratio would be driven up to 80%. And with a strong establishment of output control, we will phase out input control gradually. Last point I'd like to make is the government's support for fishermen. When there is a restructuring, then there is a subsidy for a business closure. So in the past, it was 70% of the average annual income for the 3 years, but this year it was raised to 90%, and next year it will be 100%. So we can properly compensate for the loss of income that is attributable to TAC. So for the first time, we have introduced this direct compensation system, and the system will be further expanded. So let me conclude my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you talked about the various TAC systems that the ministry is trying to adapt to, as well as the measures to support the fishermen. We do have foreign speakers joining us online. So we would like to give them to make further comments. So we have the Matthew Tan, the professor of James Cook University, and Patrick Callow from MSc. They're with us now. Do you have any special comments that you would like to make before we conclude the discussion session?
Hi. So maybe I will start first. I think it's a great summit that we've organized today. Now, I want to just quickly sum up. Now, at the end of what we are discussing today, it comes down to just one word: sustainability. How can we do it in a sustainable manner? Now, we all know the good news is in our lifetime, all of us here, we will have more than enough food. We have more than enough fish. But it is our children's generation that we are most concerned about. I have spent the last 18 years in the aquaculture industry. This is my specialty. This is my passion. And I want to say that the technology in the aquaculture industry has grown by leaps and bounds. Previously, I used to run a barramundi and a grouper hatchery. The standard for survival, 10 years ago, you put in 1 million eggs, you get maybe 8%, 10% survival. But today, because of technology and the use of technology, hatcheries, are able to, exceed 51%, survival, of their fingerling. And as a result, there are situations where, the production of fingerling, is a lot much cheaper now. I mentioned earlier on in my closing, in my keynote speech today, the ocean is like our bank account. We need to continually, top it up. We cannot, continually draw the interest and also draw out the principal. We need to think of a strategy how we can top up, our bank account, which is, the ocean, so that it becomes a sustainable practice. And hence, I broach on the subject of a teaming strategy between the aquaculture industry and the fishery industry, where I believe it's going to be highly possible in the days moving forward. APEC has set up a Center for Sustainable Development in Agriculture and the Fishery Center, and we are promoting the rise and the use of sustainable hatchery, in a bid, to produce more. I hope all the fisheries company that are present here today, I hope the days moving forward, we can forge a partnership between the aquaculture industry and the fishery industry, and of course, together with the public sector. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다.
So thank you very much. So you emphasized your message. Now, our time is almost up, and we're actually 15 minutes behind the schedule. So do you have any final comments, like in this fishery session? Maybe the panelists, I will give you 1 minute. So if you could have a burning message that you must deliver, then please. So this session was about the 2030 SDG and ESG Revolution. Oh, so the 2030 is not that distant. We came up with the goals for carbon neutrality by 2030 and by 2050, and I believe the time is really not enough. And also for the SDG and ESG, yes, we do have the goals that we have to achieve before the end of 2030. But time is not enough again. And sustainability is something that's timeless, something that we have to keep like forever. So this is something that we have to bear in mind from this session. And as for the ESG Revolution, we actually had a lot of debates and discussions before. As for the environment, it was about the environment protection and resource depletion and social. It's about the human rights. So we actually had a lot of debates regarding these issues even previously, but they are now categorized as ESG and summed up as ESG. So I believe that if we can make progresses, then this can solidify the foundation of the development of the fisheries. So I will give you one last chance, 1 minute, final comment. Or if you're too hungry, then we'll just move on to the lunch break. Do you have any comments? If not, then we are going to conclude the fishery session here. So with that, thank you very much. Why don't you give the three speakers, I'd like to thank the three speakers and also all the panelists. Thank you very much. And with that, we'll conclude.